I am a man over 50, a father, a husband once, and a name that almost got erased by a story that wasn't true. And before you decide what kind of man I am, let me tell you this straight. I didn't lose my family because I was weak. I didn't lose my fun because I failed as a father. And I didn't get replaced because I was outdated. I lost everything because I trusted the wrong person. And I got it all back because I stayed quiet long enough to let the truth do the talking. So listen close. Because this is my story, told by me, a man who was told to start over alone while his wife smiled beside another man and called him an upgrade. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why silence can be louder than screaming, and why patience can flip a courtroom upside down. And yeah, this might sound wild, but life sometimes goes absolutely sideways before it comes right back around. And when it does, it hits hard. Because when I was 52 years old, I thought I understood stability. I thought I understood marriage, fatherhood, loyalty, and time. I believed that 2 decades of showing up meant something permanent, that shared mortgages, shared calendars, shared holidays, and shared grief built a foundation no one could casually walk away from. But I learned the hard way that people don't always leave loudly. Sometimes they leave politely, with smiles and explanations that sound reasonable until you realize they are rehearsed. Because my wife Claire didn't wake up one day and decide she was unhappy. She had been preparing an exit while I was still planning our future. And I didn't see it because I trusted her voice more than my instincts. Because for years I had been the steady one, the man who worked quietly, who didn't chase attention, who believed love was shown through consistency, through being there even when nothing exciting was happening. And maybe that's why she thought I was replaceable, because quiet effort doesn't sparkle, it doesn't beg to be noticed, it just exists. And when she told me she had outgrown me, that she needed something more alive, more driven, more ambitious, I remember sitting at our kitchen table feeling like someone had unplugged the room. She said it calmly, almost kindly, like she was doing me a favor by telling the truth. She said she had met someone who challenged her, who inspired her, who made her feel seen. And then she said something that stripped years off my spine in one breath. She said, I should be grateful she was honest, because many men never get that courtesy. And she said I should start over, because she already had. And the way she said it made it clear this conversation was not an invitation to fix anything. It was a notification. And when she introduced Marcus later, not privately, not gently, but publicly, confidently, like a product launch, that's when I understood I wasn't just being left. I was being replaced in a narrative that had already been sold to others. Because Marcus was younger, louder, sharper around the edges, the kind of man who spoke in big ideas and quick promises, and Claire loved the contrast. She loved that he made her feel like she was stepping forward while I represented staying still. And when she brought him to Ethan's school event and introduced him as her partner, when she watched people smile and nod and accept this new version of her life, I saw something settle behind her eyes, relief, because the story was working. And the hardest part of all wasn't losing my marriage. It was watching my son drift from me under the weight of things he had been told when I wasn't there, watching him question my silence, my calm, my refusal to fight publicly, because from his perspective I looked like a man who didn't care enough to protest. And that hurt more than any insult Claire ever threw my way, because a child's doubt cuts deeper than a stranger's judgment. And when the divorce papers came with accusations attached, words like emotionally absent and inconsistent parent printed neatly on white paper, I understood this wasn't just about leaving me. This was about rewriting me, about turning me into a version that justified everything she had already done. And for a moment I felt the urge to scream, to defend myself loudly, to correct every lie online, to call people and explain my side. But something in me said stop, because I had spent my whole career understanding one simple truth, that noise fades but records don't, that emotion convinces briefly but evidence convinces permanently. And so instead of shouting, I started collecting, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. I opened old emails, text threads, calendar entries, shared apps, work logs, school communications, and I didn't look at them with anger. I looked at them with focus, because focus is what remains when panic burns out. And what I found wasn't shocking in isolation, it was shocking in sequence. Messages between Claire and Marcus that overlapped with dates she claimed she was alone, plans made while she was still asking me what I wanted for dinner, conversations where she coached Ethan gently but firmly on how to describe our home life in ways that sounded concerning without being specific. And through it all there was one thing that never argued, never defended itself, never changed its tone: the digital trail of time, the timestamps, the location data, the shared family calendar she insisted on using for years because she liked organization, and that calendar became the silent witness she never considered, because it showed school pickups, doctor visits, practices, trips, consistency, presence, and when she claimed I wasn't there, the calendar calmly disagreed, and I didn't rush this information to the court. I didn't leak it. I didn't threaten her with it. I handed it quietly to my lawyer and let the process unfold. Because lies grow bold when they think they're unchallenged, and bold lies eventually trip over details, and in court I watched Claire tell her story with confidence, watched Marcus sit beside her like proof of her upgrade, watched heads nod as she spoke about emotional distance and unmet needs, and when it was my turn I didn't attack her character, I described my routine, my involvement, my consistency, and then the records entered the room, not dramatically, just steadily, one document after another, and the room changed, because facts have weight, they change posture, they slow speech. They make confident people cautious, and when the judge asked questions, precise questions, the answers started slipping, dates didn't line up, explanations stretched thin, and for the first time since this began I wasn't the one being evaluated, the story was, and when the custody decision changed, when my son came back into my daily life, when he sat across from me one night and asked why I stayed quiet when everyone thought I was wrong, I told him the truth, that I trusted the truth to last longer than anger, and I watched his understanding rebuild slowly, brick by brick, not overnight, but honestly, and when the public correction came, not through gossip or social media, but through formal channels tied to court findings, I didn't feel joy, I felt relief, because being cleared isn't about winning, it's about breathing again. And Claire had to explain herself to people who once nodded along, to her family, to her friends, to the man she thought would save her but disappeared when accountability arrived, and I learned something important in the quiet aftermath. Starting over alone isn't the punishment people think it is. It's a reset without distortion. It's space to rebuild without someone rewriting your intentions. And today my life is quieter, but it's solid. My relationship with my son is honest, not perfect, but real. My work is steady. My name is clean. And when I think back to the moment she called me replaceable, I realize now what she meant was convenient, not valuable, because value doesn't announce itself. It holds up under pressure. And if there is one lesson I live by now, it's this: don't rush to defend yourself when lies are loud. Build the truth carefully. Let it stand when the time is right, because silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it means preparation. And the truth, when it finally speaks, doesn't need to shout. It just stands there, unmovable, while everything quietly falls away. When I was 52 years old, my life still looked ordinary in the quiet, invisible way that never makes headlines or posts but fills the days of millions of men who believe they are doing everything right. I had a steady consulting business that didn't make me famous or rich enough to brag but paid the bills, earned respect, and let me sleep at night knowing I wasn't cutting corners or chasing shortcuts. My days were built on contracts, long calls, careful emails, and promises I always kept. And when I came home in the evenings, I believed I was coming home to a family that still felt solid. My wife Claire and I had been married for 21 years, long enough that our arguments had softened into habits and our love had settled into routine, and our son Ethan was 16, tall in that awkward way teenage boys grow into before they figure out their bodies, still letting me beat him at chess on Sunday mornings even though I could tell he was already smarter than me and just being kind. And our house sat on a quiet street in Ohio where neighbors waved from driveways but never asked personal questions, the kind of place that feels safe because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. And back then I thought that was peace. I truly believed peace was predictability, dinners at 6, the same groceries every week, her phone face down on the counter while mine stayed in my pocket, my laptop closed by 9 because I believed being present mattered more than being available. But when I look back now, with everything I know, I understand peace doesn't disappear all at once. It doesn't shatter or explode. It leaks, slowly and quietly, like air slipping out of a tire overnight, and you don't notice until the drive becomes rough and you can't remember when it stopped feeling smooth. Because Claire didn't change in a way that would have set off alarms. There was no sudden coldness, no dramatic fights, just small shifts that felt harmless on their own. She stopped asking how my day went, stopped sitting next to me on the couch and started choosing the chair across the room, started going on long walks alone and saying it was for her health, for her mental clarity, for her growth. And like a man who trusted his wife more than his instincts, I encouraged it, told her I was proud of her for taking care of herself. Because after 2 decades together you think space is safe, you think love is durable, you think shared history acts like glue. But what I didn't know then was that while I was trusting her, She was quietly rewriting me, reshaping me into a version of myself that fit the story she was preparing to tell others, and she did it carefully, without raising her voice, without looking cruel. She began telling people I was distant, emotionally unavailable, obsessed with work, that I had checked out long ago. And the most painful part was I didn't hear any of it until those opinions were already settled, until the narrative had taken root and spread, without me even realizing I was being discussed. And then I noticed it in my son first. Ethan didn't become disrespectful. He became distant, like someone had taught him a new emotional language overnight. He stopped sitting beside me, stopped asking for help with homework, and when I asked him what was wrong, he said nothing. But he stopped calling me dad and started calling me by my first name. And that sound coming from his mouth felt like something sharp sliding between my ribs, because no insult from an adult can match the quiet rejection of your own child. And I should have asked harder questions then. I should have paid attention to the silences, to the gaps, to the way conversations ended too quickly. But I didn't, because I believed the woman I married wouldn't turn my own home into a courtroom where I didn't know the charges or the verdict. And the day it all finally cracked open wasn't dramatic either. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no broken dishes, just a calm sentence delivered with the tone of someone reading a prepared statement. Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly, voice steady and controlled, and said she wasn't happy anymore, said she had changed, said she had found someone who understood her growth. Her words, not mine. And then she said the sentence that still echoes in my head no matter how much time passes. She said I was replaceable, not with anger or bitterness, but with certainty, like she had already tested the idea and proven it true. And she told me she wanted a separation, that Ethan would stay with her, that it would be better for everyone. And before I could even understand what was happening, she added that I needed to start thinking about my next chapter alone, because she already had. And I remember sitting there nodding like a fool, because shock makes you polite and heartbreak makes you quiet. And somewhere deep inside me something shut down, not shattered, not screamed, it just went offline. Because in that moment I understood this wasn't a discussion, it wasn't a problem to solve, it was a decision already made. And I was just being informed of the role I was about to play in a story where I was no longer the husband or the father I thought I was, but the man who was quietly being written out. 2 weeks after she told me I was replaceable, Claire didn't just move on, she unveiled her new life like a finished project, not to me privately, not with any hesitation or care for the wreckage she left behind, but to the world, through smiling photos posted online, captions about fresh starts and choosing happiness, words polished enough to sound brave instead of cruel. And she didn't hide the man beside her, she showcased him. His name was Marcus, mid-30s, fit in that deliberate gym built way, confident posture, expensive watch, startup energy pouring out of him like cologne, the kind of man who talked about hustle, momentum, and growth without a trace of irony. And when I finally saw him in person, it wasn't in some quiet accidental meeting, it was at Ethan's school event, a place that had once felt like neutral ground. And Claire walked in with Marcus at her side like they were stepping onto a stage, laughing easily, touching his arm, completely comfortable, and she introduced him to teachers, parents, even Ethan's coach, not as a friend, not as someone new, but as her partner, her support. And then the word that landed like a slap, her upgrade, said casually, lightly, like a joke everyone was supposed to understand, like I was an old model that had stopped working. And the worst part of that moment wasn't Marcus standing there smiling like he'd won something. It was seeing my son beside them, quiet, unsure, leaning closer to her than to me, like gravity had already shifted. And in that instant I felt the public story lock into place around me. Because suddenly I wasn't just the man whose wife left him, I was the tired husband who couldn't keep up, the emotionally absent father who chose work over family, the outdated man replaced by something newer and shinier. And I'll admit this with complete honesty. For a brief moment I almost believed it myself, because that's what repetition does. When enough people look at you with the same judgment in their eyes, you start checking yourself for cracks, wondering if maybe you really did miss something obvious. And Claire moved fast after that, filing for divorce with urgency, asking for full custody of Ethan, painting me as unstable, emotionally neglectful, inconsistent, using words that sounded heavy but stayed just vague enough to be hard to disprove without records. And Marcus backed her quietly but effectively, paying for lawyers, helping her move into a new place before the ink on the papers was dry, positioning himself as the responsible solution to a problem she claimed I had become. And through all of it I stayed silent. No angry posts, no public explanations, no desperate messages trying to change anyone's mind. Even when friends called me telling me I needed to fight back, to defend myself, to stop letting the story spread. Something inside me told me to wait, because Claire didn't know something fundamental about me. She had lived with me for over 20 years, but she had never truly understood how my mind worked, because I had always been the planner in our marriage, the quiet organizer, the one who saved receipts, backed up files, documented conversations, not out of paranoia but because my work had taught me that contracts collapse when memory replaces proof. And without realizing it, over years of shared life, I had built a detailed timeline of my own existence: emails, text messages, calendar entries, shared documents, school communications, travel records. And when I finally sat alone in my small apartment, surrounded by boxes labeled with pieces of my old life, I opened my laptop and began reading through everything, not emotionally, not angrily, but carefully, methodically. And that's when the story I had been told, and the story being told about me, began to unravel thread by thread. Because timelines don't lie, and screenshots don't care who sounds more convincing. I found messages between Claire and Marcus dated months before she ever said she was unhappy. Hotel confirmations attached to business trips she claimed were solo. Conversations where she gently coached Ethan on what to say if anyone asked about our home life, shaping perception without ever telling an outright lie. And it felt like being hit repeatedly without visible bruises. But instead of reacting, instead of exploding the way everyone expected me to, I did something that surprised even myself. I organized everything, folders labeled by date, notes attached to conversations, patterns highlighted. Because I wasn't angry yet, I was focused, and focus is dangerous when you've been underestimated. And that's when I noticed something else, something Claire had completely overlooked. There was one witness in all of this that she never accounted for. Not a person who would argue or raise their voice, not someone who could be intimidated or persuaded, but something that had been quietly watching the entire time, keeping perfect logs, records, timestamps, something neutral and absolutely unbribable, something already listed in the case file without anyone paying attention to it yet. And in that moment I understood I didn't need to shout my truth. I just needed to let that silent witness speak when the time was right. The witness that changed everything wasn't a person with an opinion or a voice or a grudge. It was something far quieter and far more reliable. It was the family calendar app Claire herself had insisted we use for years because she liked organization and control and knowing where everyone was supposed to be. An app synced across our phones, laptops, and cloud storage, logging every appointment, every school pickup, every doctor visit, every practice, every absence automatically without emotion or bias. And when Claire claimed in court filings that I was an inconsistent father who rarely showed up, the calendar calmly showed otherwise. Weeks and months of documented involvement, color-coded blocks marking mornings I took Ethan to school, afternoons I picked him up, evenings spent at practices or meetings with teachers. And when she claimed emotional absence, emails surfaced showing regular check-ins with Ethan's school counselor, his therapist, his coaches, messages asking how he was doing, what he needed, how I could support him better. And when she claimed Marcus entered her life only after our separation, the metadata attached to messages, photos, and shared locations disagreed without hesitation. Because metadata doesn't argue, it doesn't feel guilty, it doesn't care who cries harder or sounds more convincing. It just tells time, and time is unforgiving when you lie about it. And when I finally handed everything to my lawyer, it wasn't some dramatic moment with raised voices or threats. It was a quiet meeting in a small office where I slid a hard drive across the table and said, "This matters." And the look on her face told me more than any words could have, because she didn't ask if it was real or if it could be used. She asked how complete it was. And in that moment I knew the long game had already started, because this was no longer about emotion or blame. It was about sequence and proof. And I made a decision then that I would not seek revenge in the loud sense. I didn't want to embarrass Claire publicly or humiliate Marcus. I wanted restoration. I wanted my son to know I didn't walk away from him. I wanted my name returned to me, and I wanted the truth to stand on its own without me shouting it from rooftops. So we let Claire talk. Let her tell her story in her own words. Let Marcus posture quietly beside her like he was the solution to a problem she claimed I had become. And we let the court hear everything first, because lies grow confident when they think no one is keeping score, and confidence makes people careless. And they did exactly what careless people always do. They contradicted themselves. Timelines shifted slightly each time the story was retold. Explanations stretched thin under simple questions. Details changed just enough to be noticeable. And then the silent witness spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, but through printed logs, sworn exhibits, timestamps projected on screens, and calm explanations that required no interpretation. And the room changed in a way I will never forget. not with gasps or outbursts, but with weight. The kind of weight that settles into the air when people realize a story they believed is collapsing under its own inconsistencies. And I sat there with my hands folded, watching the judge lean forward, watching Claire's certainty drain from her face as she realized control was slipping, watching Marcus shift uncomfortably as he understood he was never the hero in this story, just a footnote attached to a timeline he didn't understand. And in that moment I felt something steady return to me, not triumph or joy, but balance. Because when stories collapse, they don't explode, they sink slowly and completely, and that was only the beginning of the truth finally taking its place. The morning we walked into the courthouse, I didn't feel nervous the way people expect you to feel when everything you love and everything you've been accused of is about to be weighed by strangers. There were no shaking hands or dry mouth or racing thoughts. Instead, there was this heavy calm settled right in the center of my chest. The kind of calm that comes when you already know the worst part is behind you and all that's left is the truth being spoken out loud. Because by then I had already lived through the loss, the humiliation, the silence, the nights alone wondering how my life had been rewritten without my consent. And this day wasn't about fear, it was about exposure. And Claire walked into that courtroom like she owned the air, dressed sharp in a way that looked intentional, confident posture, chin slightly raised, Marcus right beside her like a polished accessory, whispering encouragement, nodding at the right moments, playing the role of steady support as if he had always belonged there. And when Claire took the stand, she didn't hesitate. She didn't stumble. She spoke smoothly and clearly, talking about emotional distance, about how I was always busy, always tired, always somewhere else. She described a marriage where she waited patiently for a man who never really showed up, painted herself as loyal, hopeful, exhausted from trying. And as she spoke, I could see people nodding along. Because her story sounded familiar, it fit a script people already knew. The quiet husband, the lonely wife, the inevitable drift. And familiarity is persuasive. But when it was my turn to speak, I didn't rush or raise my voice or try to sound convincing. I spoke slowly and steadily, like a man describing facts instead of feelings. I talked about routines, about waking up early to make breakfast, about school pickups marked by the same parking spot every afternoon, about doctor visits where I asked questions and took notes, about evenings spent at the kitchen table, helping with homework while Claire scrolled her phone. And I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't challenge her character. I simply explained my days. Because days are harder to argue with than emotions. And then my lawyer began placing exhibits in front of the judge one by one, calmly, deliberately, calendar logs showing presence, email threads showing communication, timestamps showing consistency, location data showing overlap, not opinions, not interpretations, just records. And that's when the air in the room changed in a way you could almost hear, like the pressure shift before a storm turns. Claire stopped smiling, Marcus leaned back in his chair and went quiet. The judge began asking questions, precise ones, short ones, questions that don't invite storytelling, and the answers that had once sounded smooth started to stumble because dates overlapped in ways they shouldn't have. Claims contradicted records that didn't bend. Explanations grew longer and less certain, and for the first time since all of this began, Claire looked directly at me, really looked at me, not with anger or disappointment, but with surprise. Because she hadn't known how much I had. She had believed I was the kind of man who would break loudly, argue emotionally, defend himself with words instead of preparation. And when the silent witness finished speaking through pages and logs and projected timelines, the judge leaned back and took a long pause, the kind that stretches seconds into something heavy and uncomfortable. And then he said something so simple and so final that it felt like the room itself exhaled. He said the court does not decide based on stories, it decides based on facts. And in that moment I didn't feel triumph or joy or satisfaction. I felt something far more important return to me. I felt dignity, the quiet restoration of being seen clearly again. And I knew right then that no matter what happened next, the truth had finally taken its place where it belonged. Ethan never took the stand. No one asked him to choose between his parents or speak words that would follow him for the rest of his life. But he sat there in that courtroom, 16 years old, shoulders tense, eyes moving back and forth as he watched his mother and father turn into evidence. And that alone was heavy enough for a kid who should have been worrying about school and friends instead of legal language and adult consequences. And when court recessed that day, he didn't go with Claire. He walked straight toward me and asked if we could talk alone. And that simple request felt bigger than any ruling, because it meant he was ready to hear something other than what he had been told. So we sat on a bench outside the courthouse, no lawyers hovering, no parents pulling him in different directions, just a father and a son who had somehow ended up on opposite sides of a story neither of us fully understood. And for a long moment neither of us spoke, because silence between a parent and child can feel louder than shouting. And then he finally asked the question I knew had been building inside him for months. He asked why I never defended myself online, why I never corrected people when they said things about me, why I let him believe, even for a moment, that I didn't care enough to fight for my own name or for him. And I could hear the hurt beneath the words, not anger, but confusion, like he was trying to understand how a man who showed up so quietly could disappear so loudly. And I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. I told him that shouting feels like fighting, but proof actually is. I told him that once people start yelling, no one listens anymore, they just pick sides. And I didn't want him caught in the middle of adult anger. I didn't want him choosing between voices. I wanted him to see the truth when it stood on its own without me pushing it. And then I did something I hadn't planned on doing that day. I opened my bag and showed him some of the records, not everything, not the parts that would turn his mother into a rilling at his eyes, just enough to show him that I hadn't vanished from his life the way the story suggested. Emails to his teachers, calendar entries with his name highlighted over and over, messages asking how he was doing, proof of presence instead of arguments about intent. And as he looked through them, I watched his shoulders slowly drop, like he had been carrying something heavy that he didn't even realize had. Wait until it was set down, because kids carry more than we think, especially when they're handed half-truths wrapped in concern and protection. And he didn't apologize right away. He didn't say I'm sorry or I was wrong. Instead, he said something that hurt and healed at the same time. He said I didn't know how loud the other story was. And in that moment I understood something important. Silence is powerful, but only when the truth eventually speaks. Otherwise, silence can sound like absence. And a week later, when the custody ruling changed, it wasn't announced with drama or celebration. It was corrected quietly, shared custody first, then primary with me, based on stability, involvement, and consistency. Words I hadn't heard attached to my name in months. And when Ethan moved back into my small apartment carrying boxes filled with pieces of his life, posters, clothes, books, memories, he didn't say much. He just stepped forward and hugged me, tight and wordless, and that hug felt like my name being handed back to me after months of being called something I was never meant to be. Is this conversation helpful so far? Claire believed that once the custody decision changed, the storm had passed, that the chapters she had written about me, about our marriage, and about my supposed absence from Ethan's life would fade quietly into the background, that people would stop asking questions and stop raising eyebrows. But she had overlooked one simple fact. Stories that have been told publicly don't vanish quietly. They linger, they shape perceptions. And when those perceptions are challenged with truth, the shift is undeniable. So when my lawyer suggested a simple, measured step, a formal public correction tied directly to the court's findings, I agreed without hesitation, because I had no desire for spectacle or dramatics. I wanted accuracy, I wanted clarity, I wanted the record straight. And when the notice went out, distributed through proper channels, community newsletters, school communications, professional networks, and official statements in the local press, the tone changed subtly but unmistakably. Whispers of doubt started replacing previously unquestioned belief. Neighbors who had stopped calling began reaching out, not with apologies or accusations, just curiosity, questions that hinted they were realizing the version of events they had believed for months or even years had been incomplete. Because truth doesn't demand forgiveness. It doesn't need to be loud or emotional. It simply requires acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, lives realignment occurs naturally. And Marcus, who had seemed so assured in his new role beside Claire, disappeared almost overnight, vanishing from social media, absent from any school events, any appearances that might have bolstered the story she wanted the world to believe. The man she had counted on to validate her narrative stepped away quietly when the spotlight turned cold, leaving Claire to explain herself, not in hushed tones or excuses to me, but to her own family, her friends, and ultimately to a judge who could see through the inconsistency she had tried so carefully to weave. And as she faced questions about timelines, emotional involvement, and her attempts to recast me as absent, I realized she was grappling not only with external accountability but with the internal reckoning of understanding that the story she had told, the version she had practiced and polished, could not survive daylight, that embellishments, omissions, and half-truths cannot withstand evidence and impartial observation. And I didn't celebrate this quietly arriving justice. I didn't need to clap or raise my voice or post triumphantly online, because what I felt was far more profound than victory. It was a calm, almost surreal sense of balance returning to a world that had been tilted for too long. I felt dignity restored, not through confrontation but through the slow, inevitable work of truth being acknowledged. And the strangest part of all was how little emotion I needed to invest in outward displays, because revenge, I realized, doesn't need to be loud, doesn't need to be about humiliation or anger. Revenge, the kind that matters, the kind that changes outcomes and sets things right, looks like quiet restoration, looks like evidence standing unmoved while false narratives crumble on their own, looks like balance being quietly restored to a life that had almost been stolen from me. And as I watched Claire answer for the story she had built, answer for the narrative she had thought would define me, and as the world around us suddenly shifted to recognize the truth, I felt an unexpected peace settle in, a knowledge that my son's understanding, my name, and my life had been returned not through spectacle, not through dramatics, but through patience, precision, and the undeniable force of fact speaking louder than any emotion ever could. And in that silence, in that slow, undeniable correction of reality, I understood that true vindication doesn't shout, it simply stands firm, letting the lies collapse under their own weight while truth quietly claims its rightful place.
Starting over alone wasn't the punishment Claire thought it would be. It wasn't a sentence or a void to fill. It was space, wide, open, unclaimed space where I could finally rebuild my life without distortion, without someone rewriting my history while I tried to live it. And the irony wasn't lost on me, because for years I had associated being alone with loss, with failure, with quiet nights filled with echoes of what could have been. But this alone, this solitude, felt like clarity, like a chance to finally breathe without someone else deciding the narrative. And my work, which had been steady but overshadowed by the drama, picked up naturally again, not because I chased it or tried to prove anything to anyone, but because trust returned. People trust consistency, and consistency, when paired with quiet competence, speaks louder than any argument or apology. And slowly the world began to realign around me. And Ethan found his footing too, slipping into routines that were familiar but now fully ours, mornings where he would pour himself a bowl of cereal while I sipped my coffee, quiet exchanges over breakfast about the small things, not about blame, not about guilt, evenings spent on the couch or at the kitchen table where questions about homework, school, and even life were asked and answered with patience, no pressure, no assigned sides. Just time between a father and son learning to reconnect outside of manipulation or narrative. And sometimes he would ask about the past, not with accusation or anger, just curiosity about why things had happened the way they did, and I answered honestly, carefully, openly, without bitterness, because I had learned the hardest lesson that bitterness poisons the teller far more than the listener, and honesty heals faster than any defense. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, life stopped feeling like recovery from trauma and started feeling like forward motion, movement that was steady and quiet, unflashy, not the kind that needed recognition or applause, but solid, reliable, grounding, a momentum built on patience and evidence, not on hype or drama. And in those moments, watching Ethan laugh at something small, seeing him comfortable and safe in a home that no longer carried tension, I understood that starting over alone had not erased me, had not weakened me, it had restored me. Because when you are finally allowed to be yourself without interruption, without someone else rewriting your story, you find that strength was there all along, hidden beneath the noise of lies and assumptions, waiting for the day when the truth could breathe, when presence could be seen, when consistency could matter more than any word spoken in anger. And that was how my life, quietly, steadily, began to knit itself back together, not in dramatic leaps, not in revenge-fueled bursts, but in the enduring, unshakable rhythm of a man reclaiming his place, his child, his dignity. And in that calm, I realized that being replaceable had never been true. It had been a story told by someone else, and now, finally, the story belonged to me again, full, unbroken, and moving forward.
For years, I carried the idea that strength meant confrontation, that if you weren't loud, if you weren't shouting and making your point clear enough for everyone to hear, you were losing, that silence equaled weakness, that being quiet was a choice for the timid or the defeated. But life, and this experience in particular, taught me otherwise, taught me that strength can be patient, steady, and quiet, that it can live in organization, in foresight, in the meticulous collection of evidence and the careful construction of a life that cannot be misrepresented because it has been documented. And in learning that, I began to understand that keeping records, documenting conversations, saving messages, marking timelines, and logging routines isn't a sign of mistrust or paranoia. It's a sign of self-respect, a way of ensuring that your life is yours and your actions cannot be rewritten by someone else's story. And I realized that the word replaceable is something people throw around when they do not understand value, when they cannot recognize what is steady, reliable, and quietly consistent. and they assume that charm or flair or public approval is worth more than integrity. But it isn't, and most importantly, I learned that children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones, parents who show up, parents who can be counted on, parents who demonstrate love through presence and consistency rather than dramatic displays or empty promises. And Ethan didn't need me to be a hero in the way movies and stories promise. He didn't need me to swoop in at the last moment or shout my truth at the top of my lungs. He needed me to be present, to be predictable, to be there week after week, month after month, to show up when he needed guidance, conversation, or just someone to sit with him while he worked through his own teenage thoughts. And in showing up quietly, in organizing my life in a way that left no room for misrepresentation, in being consistent even when it wasn't acknowledged or appreciated, I learned that consistency outlasts charisma, that time reveals truth in a way words and emotion cannot, that patience coupled with preparation is far more powerful than anger or theatrics. And in that understanding I found a strength I never knew I had, a strength that doesn't demand recognition, that doesn't need applause or validation, a strength that simply is. And that strength became the foundation of my life, the reason I could look at my son and know that despite everything that had happened, despite lies, betrayal, and attempts to rewrite history, I had been the father he needed, not the one someone else wanted to imagine. And that realization, more than any courtroom victory or public acknowledgement, became the quiet force that allowed me to rebuild my life fully, to reclaim my dignity, to restore my relationship with Ethan, and to step forward into the next chapter not as a man proving himself, but as a man who understood that silence, patience, and consistency are far more enduring than drama, and that true strength is never loud. It is measured, unwavering, and fully aware that time eventually tells the truth louder than any voice ever could. If there is one lesson I hope anyone listening or reading my story takes with them, it is that the impulse to defend yourself immediately when lies are loud, when stories have been told about you that feel unfair or cruel, is almost always the wrong one, because shouting, posting, or arguing in the heat of emotion rarely accomplishes anything other than adding noise to the very narrative you wish to correct. And I learned this the hard way, through weeks and months of watching my life being rewritten by someone I trusted more than anyone else, a woman who once promised forever, who once built a life with me, who once held our child together in her arms as part of the same family I thought was mine to nurture and protect. And I learned that the real power, the kind of power that cannot be undone by gossip, opinion, or manipulation, comes from building the truth carefully, methodically, with patience, with meticulous attention to evidence, to timelines, to facts that do not bend or fade, because stories can be retold, twisted, colored by emotion, but records remember, data remembers, logs remember, screenshots remember, emails remember, calendars remember, receipts, timestamps, and quiet witnesses remember. And those things, accumulated with care over time, hold far more weight than any argument shouted in anger or indignation. And in learning that, I also discovered something about people, about human nature, that those who underestimate quiet men often forget a simple but devastating truth. Silence doesn't mean emptiness, it doesn't mean weakness, it doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means preparation, it means observation, it means holding your ground with a calm patience that is invisible until the moment it matters most. And when that moment comes, when the scales finally tip and the records are laid bare, when the witnesses speak and the timelines are proven true, the truth doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to argue, it doesn't need to attack or defend, it simply stands, solid and undeniable. And everything else, the lies, the rumors, the carefully constructed public images, the whispered judgments, the attempts to replace, to diminish, to rewrite, everything else falls away naturally, because the truth, when fully present, cannot be denied. And I saw this not just in the courtroom, not just in legal documents, not just in the reactions of lawyers, judges, or estranged family members, but in the quiet way my son looked at me after months of half-truths, in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the way our routines, once fractured, slowly rebuilt trust, in the subtle understanding that the man he believed had been absent was in fact present all along, consistent, steady, unwavering. And that realization, more than any public correction or legal victory, proved to me the real moral I live by now, that integrity, consistency, patience, and the courage to prepare quietly for the right moment are far more powerful than any loud defense. That the world will attempt to rewrite your story, that people will assume, judge, and assign value incorrectly, that betrayal and misrepresentation can feel like devastation, but that if you allow the truth to grow, to accumulate, to stand on its own, it will never fail you. And the world, no matter how loud the lies, will eventually recognize what is real. because facts, unlike feelings, cannot be disputed forever, and evidence, unlike anger, does not fade, and in embracing that, I have rebuilt my life not by shouting, not by demanding recognition, but by allowing every record, every documented action, every patient, consistent moment to speak for me when the time was right, and it did, and it always will. And so now, when I look at Ethan, when I see him thriving in the security that comes from knowing his father is not absent but reliable, present, honest, I know that the quiet patience, the careful organization, the refusal to be rushed into defensiveness were the real victories, and the moral I live by today, every day, is simple yet profound. Do not be fooled into thinking that noise equals power or that anger equals strength, that those who shout the loudest are always right, because the men and women who endure quietly, who document, who prepare, who act not on emotion but on careful foresight, will always, in the end, be the ones who reclaim what was theirs, and their truth will stand firm when all else has crumbled, and everything built on lies, on ego, on manipulation, will collapse naturally under its own weight. And I have learned that in the silence of preparation there is more strength than in 1,000 battles. In the consistency of action there is more security than in all the arguments in the world. In the calm application of truth there is more power than in 1,000 public vindications. And I live every day by that lesson, reminding myself that what matters is not being seen fighting, but being ready, not being loud, but being true, not being acknowledged immediately, but being undeniable when the time comes. And that is the way I rebuilt my life, reclaimed my son, restored my name, and walked forward into the next chapters of my existence, not broken, not shouting, not bitter, but standing firmly, quietly, and unwaveringly in the truth that can never be taken away, because it has been proven, documented, witnessed, and lived. And in that, I have found peace, dignity, and a clarity no lie, no betrayal, and no moment of replacement can ever touch.